My name is Josh Goldberg, and I want to welcome you to a special podcast, Roundtable Edition, with the three amazing human beings that are the leaders of the Boulder Crest Institute for Posttraumatic Growth. And as a reminder, if this is the first podcast you're listening to in this series, I'd strongly encourage you to go back to the beginning, and you can get a chance for a more fuller view of all that we're talking about and what we're focused on. And today we are going to have a conversation with Dr. Brett Moore, who we've had the opportunity to work together for the better part of the last 11 years. Dr. Taryn Green, who I've also known for years, Air Force combat veteran, Director of Research and Operations at the Institute, and the godfather himself, Dr. Rich Tedeschi, who in 1995 with his colleague Lawrence Calhoun coined the term posttraumatic growth that has found all of us together at this table, which is amazing in its own way and certainly fulfilling and rewarding. So welcome to all three of you, and thank you for being with me today.
Yeah, thank you.
So I want to start with Rich. The work that you and Lawrence did really started in 1983, and then in 1995 you coined the term post-traumatic growth. And I'm curious, as you reflect back on the key concepts and ideas that you developed at that time, what would you say are the pieces that stand out as the most enduring, and where have you seen significant evolution in this science of post-traumatic growth and the frameworks that you all created?
Well, I guess there's a couple things that I would point to, and one is starting to understand the journey that people go through towards post-traumatic growth. What we've come to talk about is the process model of PTG, which is something that we revised over the years, a number of occasions. So that was an ongoing part of our work. And so the process model, what happens to people when they experience traumatic events and come to a point where they can recognize that there are valuable lessons that they've been learning. So that's one thing. And I think the other thing that's been really important is to recognize the importance of having an expert companion with you as you go through this. So the expert companionship part of this, where we point out that there are expert companions all around us in all sorts of places in life, and we can tap into those relationships in order to help us through this process.
And I'm mindful, and I think, and we're both musically inclined, although I just listened to it and you can make it. And I think about Billy Joel's statement that we didn't start the fire, except that you did, that you and Lawrence really started something, and you've continued to nurture it. And I'm curious, as you think about all of the research that's been inspired over the course of the last 30 plus years, can you talk about some of the research components of PTG that really stand out to you, whether that's, amongst certain groups, internationally, et cetera? What are some of the, I'm going to say highlights, but the more interesting pieces?
The fact that this concept has gone beyond the borders of where we started in the southeastern United States, which has a particular kind of culture and perspective on things, and has gone to all sorts of cultures and places in the world. And it's validated the whole idea that this process is universal, that even though there are some cultural differences, at the core, post-traumatic growth is a universal human experience. So that's the thing that's really been so gratifying, because if we had just been talking about some kind of local phenomenon, well, it's not that interesting. But we have stumbled upon something that is part of the human experience across cultures and across time. So that's made it important, I think.
And it's interesting. I just think about some of the queries have come in of refugee camps, earthquake survivors, just a range of people, and just the number of people who are looking at this, which I think, as we've talked about in prior episodes, is really important, right? Because it offers the perspective, nurses during COVID, that there is something that can be taken from these circumstances that's not just bad and destructive.
And the process that people go through, no matter where they are on this earth, what culture they grow up in, and what experiences they've had, as you're talking about, the catalyst for post-traumatic growth can be all kinds of things, but the process looks very much the same, and that's what's been so striking to me.
It's amazing, and I think, and sitting next to you is the last student that as a professor that was in your programs, the one and only Dr. Taryn Green. And Taryn, I'm curious, I think a key part of the work you do alongside your counterparts here is really pushing research forward. And earlier today, we were sitting in meetings, having those conversations what do you think about the future of research related to PTG, and what do you find most interesting about that arena?
I think that the sky is the limit still with PTG. What's amazing is all of the decades worth of research that we have now because of the work that you started, Dr. Tedeschi, and not only understanding that it's applicable cross-culturally, but across different traumatic circumstances. We understand that there are different ways that people come to this process, but we don't know everything about how the process unfolds in different circumstances for different people. So there's a lot to explore there. And there's different niches, I would say, where we're starting to shine lights. We find little areas that maybe there's a question like about vicarious post-traumatic growth, which we'll have another episode on, that hasn't been fully explored yet. And we can ask ourselves about how that process might look a little bit different in the context of indirect trauma. There are a lot of different avenues for us to take. So it's really exciting times.
Yeah. And it's amazing. I mean, getting the chance to work with you all at Boulder Crest is, certainly there's research that we can undertake with external partners. But there's also opportunities to do lots of stuff within our own orbit, like you said, with vicarious post-traumatic growth, with examining, a phase assessment. And just think it gets really interesting, right? Of all the things we can do and that we have access to, that we don't have to go and, we get emails all the time that people want to research, and it's like,
right.
People aren't guinea pigs, but like we have the opportunity to do stuff in a very organic fashion here, which I think is just, I don't know, neat's probably an understatement.
Yeah, you get 3 researchers together with lots of questions and some resources, and there's a lot we can do with that.
Yeah. And I think one of the other pieces is the experience that you had, which is not, a coincidence, right? You obviously were purposeful about where you wanted to study and who you wanted to study under. But I think the unfortunate reality is for most people in the profession of mental health, the odds are that they're not hearing anything about post-traumatic growth as they go through their education. And I think that's the other piece, and an important part of this podcast is like we want, for their own sake and for the sake of the people they're serving, is we want them to recognize that there's another side of kind of a non-pathological dimension to growth, right? To life and trauma.
Yeah.
So, Dr. Brett Moore, like I said, we had the pleasure of meeting alongside with Brett back in the 2014 days, and it's been an amazing journey since. And I'm curious, as you think about, and you all wear multiple hats, right? But you think about the hat of being a clinician, being a researcher, being an advisor, being a creator, is, how has it affected your practice and the way you do things, and how have you seen it evolve over the course of time?
Oh, it completely reshaped my practice. So I was one of those psychologists that had never heard of post-traumatic growth. And I know in a different podcast, we'll get into the story about how I came to understand PTG, but it was being trained as a clinical psychologist, but only in what we call the evidence-based therapies, right? The talk therapies that were truly a medically focused intervention where you identify symptoms and you choose a treatment. And then hopefully, if you're successful, some of the symptoms go away and the person supposedly is doing better. Right. And I started to struggle with that as a young clinician, and I was seeing growth, right? That's how Rich and I became friends. Is I was treating a young man actually when I was in Iraq, and I was trying to get him to focus on a particular therapy, right? I was trying to get him to engage in this what we call prolonged exposure, which is a particular treatment for PTSD. But he was trying to bring me back to this notion that I've actually experienced something good from my trauma. I was like, that doesn't make sense, right? What are you talking about, something good? And then as I got to know him and understand him in his situation, I started to see things that I didn't learn about in school, right? So I tried to figure out, what is this I'm hearing, that people are experiencing, positive changes as a result of their struggle. And then I reached out to Rich, and I had no idea there was this whole research domain out there on post-traumatic growth. And it changed my practice, fortunately, early on in my career. It wasn't 10, 15, 20 years. It was maybe 2 years within my career. So it really shaped my practice to where I look for growth in people. I don't just look for symptoms. I don't look for dysfunction. like I was trained to do.
Yeah.
So,
And one of the things I remember you saying was, if you just go around asking people what's wrong with them, but then you're going to think the world's filled with broken people. But the reason why you're getting that input is because that's the question
that's
you're
what I'm asking, right?
Yeah.
If I ask you what's wrong, you're going to tell me what's
Yeah.
wrong. If I ask you what's good, you'll tell me what's good and what's changed in a positive way.
Yeah.
But we're not taught to answer or ask those questions. So.
Yeah. And it's amazing. We have a lot of work to do. And again, for those listening to the podcast, it's like this is the very rationale for what we're trying to do, right? To be able to articulate this in lots of meaningful ways. So let's go back to the beginning for a second. In our meeting, in 2013 in September, we opened Boulder Crest, Virginia, as we now call it. And that was the first privately funded retreat center in the country for combat veterans and their families. And we wanted to do two things. We wanted to host families because Ken and Julia, who are our co-founders, they had been 21 years in the Navy. Ken was gone for 14 years. It's hard. The lifestyle's hard. Spent a lot of time in hospitals with families who had someone who was loved that was injured. And so that creates a lot of challenges and trauma in the family. So just giving people a beautiful space to connect. And then the other thing we wanted to do was host nonprofits, primarily smaller ones, running more or less non-clinical programs and wanted to use a retreat. And we thought, okay, well, we'll let them use our place for free. We'll provide the food, two biggest costs, and it'll be a perfect partnership. Of course, the best laid plans. We did not see programs that we thought were worthy of continuing to invest in. And, one of the things I'm always mindful of, and I met Ken back in November 2013. Unfortunately for me, I had laryngitis when I met him, so I just listened because I think you all know that I like to talk. And, Ken would say, and, our mission and our focus has changed just in terms of its broad and the number of people we serve and kind of their backgrounds. But he would say, I just want people to be as productive at home as they were on the battlefield. And then we had occasion to meet the two of you, right, through some mutual friends, and to start to have a conversation about what might be possible. And if we go back to that, Rich, I'm curious, we had started to kind of dabble and experiment with different things and start to pilot stuff. And I'm curious your perspective on those original conversations and on our desire to really operationalize post-traumatic growth in this work that you had been doing.
I remember meeting Ken and having a conversation. What was that?
I said that hurts a little bit. Anyway, continue.
I remember meeting Ken and having a conversation about what he was looking to do with the Boulder Crest property that he had and try to develop programs that were more effective. And we rapidly, I think, got on the same page in terms of what it is that would make some sense. So he presented this opportunity. And then, of course, you and I and Brett got a chance to design the program, which was great fun. I just remember it as a wonderful intellectual exercise that also had a great deal of meaning to it for me, because I could see the things that I've been researching and writing about come into some kind of form where we're actually going to apply this in a very well-designed fashion. I mean, we started designing the curriculum for this, thinking through how we would use it and that it would impact a lot of people. I didn't have any idea at the time, of course, how many we're talking about. But, I mean, it was really exciting and fun to try to design what this would look like. And, of course, both of you were so much fun to work with. You're smart guys, and we could communicate about where we were going so effectively. And so that was one of the best moments of my professional life, to be sitting around the two of you figuring out how to do this. It really was great.
Yeah, and I second that. That was, I think about those times quite a bit and very fondly. And part of the brilliance of Ken and you, it was that at that time, you approached this problem with kind of this beginner's mind, right? Just help me understand what we're looking at. Help me understand, as I don't know anything about this. Assume I know nothing, which was not true, because you both went out and talked to experts, and they'd led you to where you were at the time Rich and I got involved, which was the traditional treatment-focused model, clinically oriented, symptom-focused model. So you listen to what we had to say, and it's just history. We were able to create. You gave us some some leverage and some resources and some time to build something that I think has turned into, well, more than I thought we would ever. I mean,
Yeah,
tens of thousands of people.
Brett, do you remember how one of the first things we did was observe some of the ongoing program that was in Boulder Crest at the time, and I know we were critical of some parts of that.
That's one word. Yeah.
But Ken and Josh were really open to that. I mean, they really wanted to know, how can we do better? And that was refreshing too, that we could speak our mind like that, and we can come together to create something that was a little more effective.
Yeah, I remember those after action reviews. I don't remember what you called them at the time, but I remember sitting in the group after the end of a day, a long day with Ken and a few other folks, and I could tell one of the staff members was not overly receptive of my feedback and started to push back. And Ken said, just listen, right? Listen to what this guy has to say. And it became a very productive conversation. And I think some changes were made. And I think we approached it respectfully. But we probably knew what we were going to see before we even showed up, right? We had an idea of what types of interventions were being done. And a lot of what we saw was what we expected. But we also saw a lot of strengths that were already built into the program. So it wasn't a complete wash, right? It wasn't a complete rebuild. We helped refine and fine-tune the program, which is what it is today.
And I remember I was actually having a flashback at that point in time. And I remember, all these kind of amazing, the amazing pieces as you kind of reflect from time to time, and deeply grateful for the honesty. And certainly, I think from our perspective, right, the goal is the mission, and it's not personal. It's just like, hey, what is the best thing that serves folks? And I'd appreciate, I think, and we'll start with you, Taryn, and then ask you, Brett, is one of the things we kept hearing, as we kind of integrated and really made this all about post-traumatic growth very explicitly, you would have veterans and they'd look at you and they go, why the blank is nobody telling me this? Why are people only talking to me about all the ways my life's going to be damaged because of what I've experienced? Like it feels like people are trying to convince me to give up hope that life will ever be good again, and then life will be okay because I won't fight for a future that's not available. And I just remember hearing that so many different times, and I guess I'm curious your perspective on why you think it's so salient and so connective to. And I don't just think it's the veteran community, but certainly notions of PTSD and diagnosis are very ubiquitous in these worlds. Just curious why you think it's so powerful as a concept.
Well, it speaks to me when you use that terminology, because that's who I was too, having that feeling of when I was serving and struggling, that just the struggle in and of itself didn't describe my full experience. And I think I recognize that on some level, but you don't have the words. They're not mainstream to have the words to describe that there's more to the story. But I think in the military space, we're trained to problem solve. We're creative. Cognitive flexibility is at a high, and we're always coming up with solutions. We're doing these problem solving exercises that use our bodies and our minds and our spirits, and it lends itself. PTG lends itself to that. We do see some associations in the research of cognitive flexibility and concepts like that with post-traumatic growth, and creativity is an aspect of this. So I think it's inherently kind of built into our community. And that's what didn't sit well with me was I had my own struggles. And again, it wasn't the complete story. There was so much more that I needed to discover. And until I found the work of Dr. Tedeschi and Dr. Calhoun, I didn't have the words to describe it. Of course, you can find those words in so many places. You can find them in religious texts. You can find them in philosophy and literature and poetry and art. And now I understand that. But yeah, we have to give people the tools, and we have to give them the language to be able to describe what they're experiencing and the full range, really, of the human experience.
I reflect on two things. I think one is talking to someone who was a senior leader in deploying like crazy deployment cycles. And he was telling me this story then in like 2011. And it was just like just constantly deployed to war zones. And sitting in a room with about 6 or 8 other senior officers and sheepishly starting to acknowledge like, hey, so like, I know we're supposed to be all jacked up, but I really feel like, my appreciation for my relationships, like sheepishly trying to like start a conversation that maybe something positive has occurred. And I think about General Mattis talking about PTG, right? And he talks about this idea that people shouldn't have to apologize for some of these things. It's just so interesting when you talk about it as like, you shut this thing down and you don't provide people with language or framework. And there's almost this like, well, you shouldn't be able to experience these things. And I find it really interesting as well.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second piece to the point of your experience is we were doing this session with a bunch of Marines, and they looked at me and they said, well, I feel like we inflict PTG on our Marines, right? Like they come in and we shave their head, and then we like tear them down and we put them through the crucible, and then we do it because we, they're going to be strong and better than the rest. I'm like, yeah, I know. Like, so why is it when that same Marine starts to struggle, you suddenly want to like give them a weighted blanket and send them away
Right.
versus like knee to knee lead them and coach them through what they're experiencing the same way you would in sort of Marine challenges. And I'm just curious your take on like how it is that we like, and look, there's aspects of it. Let's like pain is weakness, leaving the body, suck it up. Like there are aspects of it that sort of do not provide people with the opportunity to actually like, work through it. But I'm just curious, like, how do you feel like we got off kilter with that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a combination of factors, right? It's not just one thing, but there's the resilience kind of approach, the pull yourself up by your bootstraps, which can work with us and against us in some regards. Combine that with the security clearance aspects, people not wanting to go to the mental health, and the fact that where you're told you should go if you're struggling is mental health. So you have all these different things intersecting, and I'd be curious, Brett, for what your experience is too here. But I think it creates a kind of pressure where we don't want to really talk about the struggle part, but the sad thing is that that's where the growth begins, right? We often have to get to that place of acknowledging our struggle, and when we try to do that by ourselves, we just don't have the tools or the language sometimes. We sometimes just need an expert companion who can help us to see where we are in the process and be able to just walk alongside us. It's not something that should be pathologized. It's a very human experience, but I think there's some of those factors that have come into play that prevent people from wanting to admit that there's a struggle going on, which is just a human thing that's happening to them.
And one of the things, I mean, Taryn, you raised all of the challenges, and I think it was 2014, 2015, the Army went and talked to a bunch of soldiers who had attempted suicides but did not complete suicides. And it was like 65% of them had never gone to mental health. And so they went to them and said, hey, we're just curious, like clearly you were not doing great. Why didn't you go see somebody? And the number one reason was they thought they could figure it out on their own. And then, you think, and you've been struggle, I've been through struggle, like you feel like you have this misguided confidence that you know what you're doing. And then you start to realize that you don't. And then self-medication kicks in, sleep deprivation kicks in, and like you kind of fall off.
You go
fast,
with what
right?
you know.
Yeah.
And you don't know about post-traumatic growth or the paradox of it all. So you do the things that you're used to doing, but those don't work anymore.
Yeah.
And that's part of the culture too, of the veteran culture and the first responder culture, is I fix my own shit, right? I don't need somebody else to tell me how to get my stuff in line. So it's a cultural piece as well, where I think someone in the general population is more likely to go and consult with the mental health professional, where the veteran or the first responder is not. They would be more likely to try to do it themselves, and it's hard to do it yourself.
But it's funny because that's also a strength, right? That people in the military can fix their own shit, right?
Yep.
So they just need somebody to maybe consult with along the way.
An expert companion,
Yeah.
Which I feel like, and you guys were both in the military, I was not, but it's like there is an aspect of mentoring and coaching and training that goes like, it's not, you're not really doing it all on your own. Like there's plenty of times where you get told to FIFO it, right? And let's figure it the blank out but generally speaking, like you're being taught and your capacity is being built, and then you're expected to then perform to that capacity. So it's just interesting that like that story isn't, I always like laugh when it's like, oh, it's a self-made man. I'm like, nobody's a self-made. Everyone's got people who influence us and affect us in some meaningful way. And I'm curious, so in that spirit, one of the things that was clear to us, and one of the kind of poles I talk about is this idea that you have, trust is highest here. Like inside of the veteran community, inside of the military community, you have the highest levels of trust. And one of the big challenges, and this has changed a lot over time, was that expertise sat here. In that our bet was it was wiser to try to build expertise where there was trust than try to create trust where there was expertise. And ultimately, obviously, we're all sitting at a table together. You want the whole spectrum to function with lots of doors that exist that include chaplains and other kinds of people. But I'm curious your take on what we say is the democratization of mental health, and especially the focus and use of peers. And I know, Brett, this is not sort of a foreign concept to you in terms of the work you did in the military, but I'm just curious if you could speak to this idea of your take on that approach of sort of a training-oriented approach, which is what we call our programs, and then the notion of peers and of really going into where there is high trust and trying to build capacity inside of that.
Yeah, it goes to and if you think about the program, the Warrior Path program, the flagship program, which is administered by peers that have familiarity with the culture and they share the same culture. People trust people that they share interests, similarities, culture with, right? And if you think about historically, what mental health people, what are we, 100 years old? Our profession, if that, people have been healing and have been dealing with trauma since the beginning of time, not through mental health people, but through people within their communities, clergy, friends, family, whatever support network they had. You don't have to look too far back to see how people came through difficult situations without the use of mental health professionals. I mean, mental health professionals, as a psychologist, I believe in what we do, and I think we do very important work. But you don't need us, per se, to figure out how to overcome the challenges that you've dealt with in your life. You need to find someone you trust that understands you, that when you're talking to them, they make you feel like you're the only person in the world at that point, and you truly understand what they're going through. Mm-hmm. That's how people change. That's the catalyst, I think, is when you feel understood and when you feel like you are connected to someone. That's the catalyst for change.
It's interesting. I remember this Green Beret who had served in Vietnam and then became a professor, and he talked about this idea that veterans come from a culture that's wordless, and they know what each other needs because at some point they needed the same thing. And I think there's that piece. And Rich, this feels like it harkens back to, we talked about this in the first episode, but to your initial work, right? Working with bereaved parents who had suffered, and granted, there are some different circumstances, but they could look at each other and understand that they knew that same pain. And there's something in that. And I'm just curious if you could speak to, I don't know, the importance of shared experience when it comes to building connection and allowing people to open up and speak to their challenges.
Sometimes there aren't any good words for how bad it is. And that's why being with someone else who you can assume in certain ways because of their similar experiences just gets it, and you don't have to explain. You don't have to find the language. Because it's too bad to find it. So that's where this expert companionship, that Brett's talking about here, plays such an important role, where you don't have to feel like you explained yourself. You have to justify yourself. You're part of a group of people who just inherently understand what it is you're going through. And that's such a relief to find a place like that where you feel safer.
And I think about this, and I think about the people who might be listening to this who work in mental health, and it's like, okay, well, what do I do, right? It's like, what are the steps and what is this? And I think some of that's kind of a function of the manualized treatments, but it's like, the more important question is like, how should you be? And I feel like, it was really interesting. We did a struggle well program in Miami, and we had a woman who worked with victims of crime. And she got called, the in-between was a 5-day class, and like on night 3 got called in because she had to go comfort. It was a child who was killed in a traffic accident. And she went to the hospital and she saw the grandmother there, just distraught. And at first she's, because you get in your head, like, what do I say? What are the right words? And she reflected on it. It's nothing we told her to do. It was just talking about and so, but she just sat down next to this lady and just held her hand. And it like chokes me up now because it's like whatever happened in the class gave her the mindset, like, there's nothing to say. I'm just going to hold this lady's hand. And she squeezed her hand and just held her hand for an hour. Mm. And at the end gave her a hug and was like, thank you. But she didn't do anything, but she did everything because It's just there's cold comfort in trying to find the right terminology. And I'm just curious your take on the like how versus the what, if that makes sense, which I think is at the heart of who you are, but also of expert companionship.
We have these training programs, professional training programs that teach us to do things. And I think most people who come into these programs, mental health programs of various kinds, are assuming that they're going to get taught to do something that will change people, heal people, comfort people, do something that's really remarkable this way. And then you find out how weak these methods really are. It's like you try to do these things, and sometimes it's just not doing much because you skip over too often in these programs the human connection that you're talking about there. And we've lost sight of that so often in our methods of doing something technically impressive somehow. And now it's gone, frankly, it's gone into other ways that people believe that we make a difference in people that suffer. Now we have all these machines we're going to use, and all this equipment we're going to use, or particular drugs we're going to use. There's all these apparent technical solutions that people keep looking for as a shortcut to healing people so they don't have to suffer. And I understand that suffering is a terrible thing and people don't want to extend it in any way and they want to put an end to this suffering. But I think along the way we just lose our way because we skip over the hard work that's involved in moving through suffering. And the hard work involves just what you're talking about, where that woman came and just held that other woman's hand. That's a hard thing to do. That is really hard. When you realize, I can't do anything to bring this child back, and therefore I can't do anything to make this person feel any better in this circumstance. All I can do is be present. And it doesn't feel like much. That's hard work, to do something that doesn't feel like much in a circumstance like that, and admit the limits of your capabilities. So we keep looking for these shortcuts, this stimulator, this pill or this
Blanket.
program or this this is going to do the trick. It's hard to get to the point where you realize that's not what it's about. And like you, I can't operate that way. I'm just not capable. I tear up real easy, and I've just had to accept that.
You're a crier.
I'm a crier, and but I think you're exactly right that it's that sort of human connection that makes the difference. How does it make a difference? It allows people to trust you, to feel safe with you, and then if they can do that, then they can be open to themselves and start to share what's going on in them. And then you get some real important emotional work done because they know that they're emotionally safe in this circumstance, so they can open themselves up and start to take a look at themselves. So then all sorts of things can start to happen. So that's why it's important.
Well, it's the whole idea in the common factors research, right? And it's no surprise that consistently we find that what's the most important thing in psychotherapy?
It's the relationship.
It's the relationship. It's not technique. It's not even years of experience. It's not about your degree. It's about the relationship. Time and time again, the research has shown that.
And that's why, of course, the peer approach is available to us, because it's all about relationship. So it's so much more effective when people find a relationship they can trust like this than finding something that's sort of a technical process that they go through. And that's why peers are good, because they often aren't hamstrung by all these expectations of being professional or having to do this program or a certain way or this technique or all that kind of stuff, which gets us off course.
Right.
And I think about this as you guys described this, and I find it really interesting. It's like you have, budding mental health professionals who are like learning and internalizing the message of like, don't feel, right? And then you have military folk, right? And first responders who are internalizing the message of don't feel. And then
Uh-huh.
they're supposed to sit in a room together and help one another.
Right.
And it's like, well, it's no surprise. I mean, our buddy Harry works with us, who was in the special ops community, where he talked about like he had three emotions. It was like anger, rage, and like anger. And then he said he was reading some Brene Brown book. He's like 87 emotions. But it's so interesting when you think about like that you basically have people who are like frozen and just locked up inside. And I think there's, something that's just deeply unhelpful. But I also feel like, Taryn, you're really pioneering, leading this work that Rich started 20 years ago about vicarious post-traumatic growth. Is if you don't feel, then you don't get the benefit of actually
Right.
getting to be a part of people's journey. I just don't know
Right.
your take on kind of thinking. I mean, maybe just touch, because we will have an episode on vicarious PTG. But like, can you touch on that and like why those things
Yeah.
are interlinked?
Yeah, in fact, the two groups that you were mentioning, mental health professionals and then military folks, you think about how they're trying to train themselves not to feel because they're going up against things that are going to invoke a lot of feeling, right? In the mental health profession, you're going to be sitting in a room with a lot of problems and people struggling and a lot of feelings. And so I think it's natural for many people to try to put up a buffer against that, and we don't want to be seen as falling apart or be seen as weak. I think it can be seen as weak, maybe that we're going to tear up. And in the military group, similarly, they're going to be exposed to things that a lot of us wouldn't be exposed to, depending on the occupation, and they need to develop those barriers and those ways to compartmentalize and hold that experience without falling apart. But we have to create that space where we can then later access that part of ourself that might need a little bit of tenderness and trust and even connection within ourselves. And in our program, in our laboratory here, our PTG lab, our guides who are peer guides, they talk about it as trust and connection. And I love it because they talk to us all the time and they ask us all about the phases and the domains. And then so many times it comes back to, well, the answer is just, do you have trust and connection? Because without that, you can't really do any of the other stuff. And so I think that applies in the therapy room, outside the therapy room, and in every single population.
And Rich, I can't help but think, and his, books are beautiful, but, at least my kind of telling of the story is like Carl Rogers is this sort of pioneering but outcast psychologist talking about client-centered psychotherapy. And I say that because with all due respect, I'm like, if it's not about the client, what the hell is it about? Well, the clinician or the modality, but it should be about the client because they're the person you're trying to help. Because then he became the head of the APA and so forth. But you studied under like that's well before PTG world. That was the focus of what you did when you were getting your PhD, right?
Yeah, I was fortunate enough to study with the director of graduate training where I went to school at Ohio University, was a student of Carl Rogers and worked with Rogers on some of his early research on psychotherapy, doing recordings of psychotherapy sessions. This was back in like the 1940s and 50s. And so, yeah, I learned that from William Snyder, his name was. And so he was the first person that taught me psychotherapy. So I guess it stuck.
And it's so interesting because one of the things I wanted to talk to you guys about, and we will talk about, the frameworks of post-traumatic growth and the places where people grow and how people grow. And certainly they're important. But the central point to your point about common factors, the research, John Norcross, who's on our scientific advisory panel, like it's the relationship. That's what unlocks the other things. And this is one of the questions I was going to ask you about is like, what are the most important elements to facilitate growth? But we just ended up talking through the primary element, which is this idea of relationship. And I'm also mindful, I'm a big, Viktor Frankl fanboy, and he said something to the effect of, if you treat people as machines in need of repair, you will undermine the very self-efficacy people need to be able to make the changes for their life to be good again. And I think that's the challenge. And I think that's what we're positing to people is, you have to trust yourself. You have to be open. You have to be curious. You have to be creative. And you get the opportunity, if you do that, to let people teach you about their lives and their experiences. And I think it's got to feel, if you're a new person in the profession, like to have a certain level of certainty of like, okay, if I do this 12-session protocol and I do this thing, but to your point, Brett, like you quickly realize that, as you said, it's just like it's not, that's not how human beings work. They're not. It ain't cars, and even cars are not quite that way. And so it's just trying to be able to understand that, I think, is powerful and important. And I am a big fan of Vikram Patel, a psychiatrist, right? Who, his quote is, "Mental health is too important to be left to mental health professionals alone." And it's just based on the recognition that it's impossible. Like, for all the struggle that exists in the world, there aren't enough qualified professionals to handle it. So you have to try to figure out the same way we did, and the Vikram's analogy is global health. It's like, you figure out where's the highest level of trust, where you can, in an effective way, try to execute something, and you'll find that you can get interventions done, whether it's, distributing medicine, tuberculosis, malaria, et cetera, effectively, and you just adopt those methods. And so I think that's a piece of it. And the other piece, like you said, is, Ecclesiastes, right? There's nothing new. We just find new ways to say old things. And I think that's the interesting truth of humanity is how we do that. So a few, I think, thoughts on closing. I think one would be, as you look at, I think, the future of mental health and mental health profession, what do you see as the sort of opportunities and the areas where I think it's important to be able to do some more research, additional training? And then one other thing that, we discussed a little bit earlier today was that the DSM is sort of, going to go through some things. So I'm sorry, Brett, if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I think instead of trying to replace what we have now, so the treatments that we have for trauma, depression, anxiety, it can be effective for some people, right? So, but I think if we can try to inform, educate mental health professionals about, you can actually integrate the practice, the principles of post-traumatic growth, expert companionship into your practice, in how you can integrate these into your existing treatments and the way your theoretical orientation, you're becoming a stronger clinician, right? You're going to be able to help more people and help people in a different way. So for any mental health professional listening to me, I'm not asking you to give up prolonged exposure, or cognitive processing therapy, or brief CBT for depression, or whatever your go-to treatment is. But think about how you can incorporate some of the principles of post-traumatic growth and how you can facilitate that in the people you work with. I think you'll be a better, well-rounded clinician, but I think you'll be to the VPTG stuff, the vicarious post-traumatic growth. I think you'll be a happier clinician.
And so, and my language for that would be, PTG is not a modality, it's a mentality. And that is something that is not mutually exclusive from any other thing that exists, is that it can integrate into all of those things. I don't know, you guys have written to it.
Right.
Karen,
It's just a way of recognizing how human beings function in the aftermath of very, very difficult situations, suffering and trauma and tragedy and all of that. It's just a way of recognizing this is what happens to us, and this is the pathway forward through this that we have to acknowledge and work together with. So, as Brett is saying, we can integrate that concept and that way of being with people with some of these other interventions. But we have to have the flexibility not to be so rigid about these interventions that we plow ahead and don't listen to what people are going through and what they really need from us. So that's where these manualized therapies that are too rigid and demand us to go through a particular procedure, I think can lead us astray.
And just thinking about the question that you were asking about opportunities for the future of mental health and research and how we push this idea forward, what about it is the most important area? And for me, I think it's the idea of hope and agency that underlies PTG, that we see in the stories of the participants that come to our programs. And you can read in every great story of post-traumatic growth that somebody at some point regains that sense of hope and agency, and usually they don't do it alone. So I think we have to study that, because we sure know a lot about the problems and overwhelm and distress and PTSD. There's mountains to read about all of that. And I think we're doing a good job pushing the research forward and exploring those different corners of what else is possible? And like what you're saying, there's a whole story that has to be told, and not just one piece of the story. It's not just the struggle. And it's not that we have to keep the struggle inside ourselves and never share it with anybody. We really have eliminated a lot about how struggle happens for people, what factors contribute to struggle. And sadly, the struggle is ongoing and ends in, suicidality is a big problem, as you said in the beginning. So how do we counterbalance that in the research world? How do we push forward research agendas that prioritize hope and agency, seeing the full picture of what's possible for people? Those are the kinds of questions that I think are really exciting.
So final question. How has being engaged in this work, and Brett, you spoke to this a little bit about how you make you happier and change you. How has it changed you? How has it impacted you?
It's let me know more clearly what it means to be a human being, and allowed me to see into the dark corners of people's lives, while at the same time being impressed by how people can get out of those corners when you can shine some sort of light on what is possible for them. And that's the story that I keep running into again and again, which is really inspiring for me and keeps me doing this work because it's a wonderful thing to see.
I'm struck. I love quotes. You guys know that. And, Yeats said that it takes more courage to explore the dark corners of one's own soul than it does to be a soldier on the battlefield.
Mm.
And I think that's why trying to do this stuff alone is just a dangerous game. But when you trust that you're with somebody, I think we've all had the experience of going through something that's terrifying. But when someone's there with you, whether it's as a kid, whether it's as an adult, like you're more willing to do things you wouldn't otherwise do because of it. So thank you, Rich. Taryn, how has it changed you?
Oh, working with PTG, it's transformed my life before I even knew I was going to be working with it, going through my own PTG experience. But it led me ultimately to be with you guys, to be able to study and work with the godfather and the god uncle and the god cousin, whatever you
I like
are.
the god uncle. I like that.
It's not just you guys. The entire organization at Boulder Crest is full of PTGers, these people who are doing just that thing that you said, Yeats, it said takes a lot of courage to do. And it's helped me transform my life in that way too. I academically study these concepts and I'm so geeky. I'm always trying to figure it out more and looking at it from another angle. And then I'm connecting with people in my personal life who are living it and walking it. And I'm drawn to those people here and in my personal life. So it's a whole life thing for me. And it's an amazing journey.
Awesome. Thanks.
Yeah. And it's just given me a renewed passion for my work and my work with people, whether if I'm doing therapy or writing a prescription, I don't look across from me and see symptoms and a collection of symptoms and dysfunction. I see hope and promise and change and the potential for growth. And, that's where I want to be in my career. So,
it's like if you're fortunate in your life, and I believe this to be deeply true, is like you get the good fortune of crossing paths with amazing people. And I believe deeply the best thing that ever happened to me through a set of random circumstances I met Ken. And then that sort of, just like every great story, right? All of a sudden, like a bunch of more doors open up and, getting to meet the two of you, and we've had some amazing times. And I remember sitting, out on the back of the patio in Arizona in September 2016 and sitting here, 11 years later and 10 years later, and we got someone donated us a ranch in Wyoming, and just all the crazy things that have happened. And I think with Taryn, getting to do some work with you and then having you go do some other things and then having you come to a conference and being like, wait a second, she belongs here. She's one of us. And you agreeing to make that leap. It's certainly on a deeply personal, deeply human note. Knowing the three of you has changed my life, and it is one of the greatest blessings. And I think it's not just that what we get to do is meaningful. It's that I think we have a great deal of joy doing it. And I'm just deeply grateful for you. And I hope that for those listening, like I said, we will go through and talk through the phases of post-traumatic growth and all of those things. But I hope you take away listening to three people who eat, breathe, and sleep this, that the how is more important than the what, and the relationship. And we know this, but the relationship is so important. So I hope that this is meaningful. I hope it's transformative, and you keep coming back and keep listening to the podcast and keep getting the opportunity to learn from these amazing human beings. So thank you.